This video is for anybody who just wants to get started with 3D printing. And if you're somebody who has been procrastinating to get into it for a while, this video will be perfect for you. I recently got the Creality Ender 3 V3 SE, which is one of the most beginner-friendly 3D printers that you can get at a low price point. And I think it's a really capable printer. So if you wanted to get started but don't have a high budget, this could be a good option for you. So how do you actually start 3D printing? What do you need to know? What should you buy? And how does it all work? Let's break that all down. The first thing you'll need is a printer. Like I said, I got the Creality Ender 3 V3 SE just a few months ago. It's about 280 Australian, but I'm pretty sure I've seen it under like 250. To be clear, this is not sponsored. I just think it's a good printer. Anyway, after a few months of using it, here are my thoughts. The Ender 3 that I have right here is not something I would normally buy just because I'm usually trying to min-max my purchases. So I usually end up in like the mid-range, which is like prosumer, very enthusiast type purchase. But I do really like it, and the printer has just allowed me to get started. And knowing what I know now, if I went back in time and I wanted to just get started in 3D printing and I didn't want to spend a lot, I would actually buy that printer with my own money. But enough about that, let me show you what the unboxing looks like. So when you get the Ender 3, it essentially comes in like a few parts. A lot of other printers are less assembled and they come with heaps more parts, right? So you're just spending more time building this thing before you actually start. Now, if you're somebody that wants to learn the most about your 3D printer and understand every component, great, there are benefits to that. But if you're someone who just wants to print stuff, then I don't recommend going those other options. And typically the more expensive the printer, the less assembly you're gonna have to do. Like other ones just come pretty much ready out the box. Now, the actual setup of the printer was easier than I imagined. It probably would take you about like 15 minutes. I was filming, so it took me a little bit longer, but even then, I still felt like it was really simple. It comes in about 4 parts. You pretty much just throw those together with a few screws. You run a bit of cabling. You essentially plug in a few cables and you're ready to go. Next up is leveling. And instead of manually leveling this thing, it actually auto levels, right? So it does have like deviation in the surface. It just marks these points and adjusts how it prints. So it's not actually adjusting anything. It's just changing how it's printing along that bed surface. Long story short is you just don't have to worry about it being level like other printers. Then you just grab any roll of filament you want to use, cut it at a 45-degree angle, push it in to the hot end. And then when you're finished with that, I just did an initial extrude just to start pushing the filament through. After that's done, you're ready to start printing. So I've wanted to get into 3D printing for a long time, but I've just kept putting it off. So I reached out to a company called Jcar and I asked them if they wanted to collab on this printer for a short form video. And they said, yeah, sure. We'll throw in some other stuff as well. I also got sent a bunch of tools. And even after a few weeks or months of using the printer, I find I don't even touch all of those tools. Some of them I don't even know what they're for, but there are some that are genuinely useful in that pack, right? So the Ender 3 actually comes with some tools, and those are like the bare minimum essentials that you actually need. It comes with like this print scraper, just to help you get some prints off the bed, and some slide cutters just to actually cut your filament to go into the hot end. So again, it just makes it a lot easier to just get started. Now, in terms of the material that you should use to 3D print, I was given some eSun filament, just some like gray and orange, and I don't think it's particularly expensive. I have tried some other ones since, and there's not like a noticeable difference, right? So if I were you, honestly, don't overthink it. And they usually come in these 1 kilogram rolls. So even if you do make a bad buy, like you probably smash through that filament pretty quickly anyway. I got all my tools, I got my filament. It's time to print. And the great thing is that Creality actually puts a print on the included SD card. It's just a test print with like pre-configured settings just to make sure your printer's running pretty smoothly. And even though I didn't actually do anything, it's still sick to see your printer start like moving the very first time. Like there's no better feeling than that. Literally just hit print, but I was stoked. I sat there and watched it for ages. And keep in mind, this is probably only like 20 minutes after you've just got your package delivered to your door, unboxed it, put it together, and you've already done your first print within like the first hour. That's actually how easy it is to say you've done your first 3D print. But that's the easy part. Now comes to real prints where you're actually finding parts and you're actually printing them yourself. Now, this is where I made a fumble and I ran into 2 walls essentially. Now, the first was I overthought it and I started doing research because now I just wanted to make sure that my next print was going to be good as well. I wanted to see all the settings, all this other stuff. And pretty much I just overwhelmed myself with a bunch of tutorials and things I just was not ready for yet. And it slowed me down heaps And what made it worse as well is that I started doing other collaboration videos around 3D printing before I knew even what to do. That was the point of those collabs, but still it made me want to get it right. Anyway, my old man asked me to print a little battery base for him, and that's where I hit my second wall. This time I thought I was actually doing something, and that was calibration. Now, I am jaded with calibration. I hate it. I hate it. What is printer calibration? It's essentially just adjusting printer settings or slicer settings to get the best results possible from your printer. And a way to do that is by printing some test prints. And I essentially printed this little benchy boat just to begin. Now, why you would print something like this is just because when you inspect it, you can see like some of the issues that are showing up on your print, and that allows you to tweak some settings. It's pretty funny actually, because I didn't know what to expect from the quality of a 3D print. So when I printed my very first benchy, it was actually good. I just didn't know that. So I saw a little bit of stringing. Like, stringing is essentially where there's like, looks like a spider web on your part. And that's when I decided to research how to prevent it. I saw on Reddit that someone did this little retraction test, which is just 4 little columns slowly getting smaller at the top, and they take about 15 minutes to do. You essentially tweak your settings and adjust them so you minimize the webbing between each of these things. I started tweaking settings, and somehow the test print got worse. Now, when I started to reduce the stringing, it actually introduced other problems. Long story short, just do not do this test. I don't even think it's good, just because the top is even so thin that it kind of doesn't even print properly anyway. Actually, in like a future video, I'll show you how to properly calibrate, not based on these little prints. But yeah, I essentially wasted so much time. I thought 15 minutes here and there, but it was days, right? Because you have to like slice it, export it onto a SD card, put it into your printer. You wait the 15 minutes, you wait for it to cool down, take it off the bed, inspect it, and then adjust your settings, redo that whole process. And it's just a time suck for no good reason. Essentially, I spent about a week doing those tests and like tweaking it here and there in between like other stuff I'm doing. And to be honest, even at the end of it, I think it did more harm than good, because what you'll quickly realize, and what I realized, is that that was only a 15-minute test. So if you're tweaking settings or you're slowing it down or whatever it is, and you apply that to a big print, it adds significant time. Like, it was taking me so long to do, especially when you do retractions. Retractions take time. So the more you do and whatever, they will just slow down your prints. I was like adding hours to my print jobs, like my bigger print jobs. After the 50 tests that I did, I reduced the stringing, great, but I also introduced some other issues and slowed down my print times. And I actually wanted quicker print times. So a couple of little spider webs between parts that I can easily like pull away, it actually doesn't matter. It wasn't a significant issue. I will take that hands down every single time, as long as my print times are quicker and my quality is better. Long story short, unless it's a significant issue, don't try and fix it. At least when you're a beginner, right? Just because there's so many unknown variables to you that you're going to spend so much time trying to fix issues that you don't really know how that's affecting other parts of your print. I think just get a feel for it, right? Do small increments and do one thing at a time, just so you don't like lose track of what's helping and what's making it worse. At this point, I was just overly keen to print something that was not a boat or a retraction test. So I decided to help my dad out with his little battery base. It was actually a custom part. So again, just adding more time between when I could actually print. Fortunately, it was a pretty simple model, right? I wouldn't recommend trying to start modeling your own parts straight away. There's heaps of websites with thousands upon thousands of free and awesome files that you can print straight away. But the process was pretty simple. I just used Fusion 360. There's a free version. Essentially, it's just a couple of sketches, which are just like rectangles. You extrude that, you draw another sketch, you cut that. I'll probably do a deep dive into 3D modeling in a future video, but that part was pretty simple. Now, when you have a 3D part and you want to actually print it, you will need a slicer, which essentially just cuts up that 3D model into individual layers that your printer can actually print. I use Cura just because it's one of the most popular slicers out there, so you're going to get a ton of support. There's heaps of articles, videos, you name it. Don't be afraid to start with Cura and switch over later. They're all really similar. To make it super simple for you, if you're going with the Ender 3, you just find that printer on whatever slicer you choose. The standard nozzle that comes on this printer is 0.4, so I would go with a 0.2 layer height. And layer height is just like your resolution. So it's just like for a television going from like 1080p to 4K. Just think of it like that. I'll just put it on the preset settings and just hit slice. So you can put that on an SD card, put it on your printer, and then hit go. Don't overthink the slicing part, especially because it can be pretty intimidating. And I think you can learn those settings over time, just whether you want to print faster or get better quality or add supports, that sort of thing. The issue that I did face was the physical size of the printer, like the build volume. The actual build volume of this printer is 220 by 220 by 250. That is something that's pretty important when you are choosing a printer. This is like a medium-sized printer, I'd say. I know a lot of people recommend like the Bamboo A1 Mini and that sort of thing. Depending on what you're using it for, I would say tread carefully, just because you're gonna physically limit yourself with what you can actually print in that space. Even with my dad's part, it was too long. It was too long to actually fit on the plate. So instead of just printing a really simple rectangular battery base, I had to print it vertically. That may not sound like a big deal, but it introduces several problems. And this is all dependent on what your part is, right? Printing horizontally is way quicker than printing vertically, especially when it's a very long piece. It spent a lot of time going up. Essentially, a 3D printer can't just print on nothing. That's why it starts on a base plate and it works its way up. Sometimes you can have what is called a bridge, where you essentially just have two parts that have been built up, and then you can put some filament on them, but there is going to be some issues with them, right? But what's often done is people put in supports. You essentially put in a little bit of filament that you pull out at the end, right? That's just to give it a bit of stability. So while it's going over that bridge, it has little contact points or supporting material to hold it in place. So I had to put in supports, waste so much filament just because my bed size wasn't big enough. And I don't even think it was that big of a part, to be honest. There are printers with bigger beds than this, but they cost quite a lot more. I do think this is a good size, right? I think you can get most of what you need on this. It's just something to consider. Another thing was, as I was printing this thing, essentially that the cable that was running into like the hot end of my printer, the actual head that is printing the material, it got so high that almost started interfering with the top of the gantry. In mid-print, I was nervous about this. I'm pretty sure I gave it a bit more slack, right? Because I think if I kept it stiff and still where it was, I think it would have been putting some major force on the cable or the hot end. Yeah, so I'm a bit unsure about the actual printer design from that standpoint, but that's only if you're like printing at the absolute maximum volume of this thing. Probably the biggest issue though with that print is actually strength. And that depends on like how it's bearing the load. So like, where is the weight on this part? If you have a bunch of like flat layers like that and you're putting weight here, they're gonna help each other support that weight. If you have layers running like this, which is what I did, it's a lot weaker, right? But all of these issues can be mitigated. They have simple solutions. You could increase the infill density, the wall thickness, etc. And that's what I did, right? The part came out fine. There was no real issues with it. I think it just took a little bit of like extra work, but for the most part, I was really happy with my first print. What I was really surprised at though, was it took 24 hours. That was insane to me. Like, I couldn't believe that. I knew 3D printing takes a long time, but that really was a long time. And I didn't even think that was a big part. But I mean, if you're just doing one print per day or overnight or something like that, it's not really a big deal. And even at that point, I still felt like I barely knew what I was doing, even though I had spent hours upon hours researching and doing these calibration tests and even modeling my own part. And honestly, if I had spent less time researching and trying to get things perfect to get going, I think I would have had a lot more fun. And I think I would even know a little bit more because I probably have done a few more prints in that same time. But with that being said, I still feel like I learned a ton, and it was actually really easy to just get started. Now, if you're somebody that wants to get into 3D printing, here's some thoughts I would have for you. Now, the Ender 3 is really easy to get started with. The only major issue I would say with this printer is that it doesn't have filament runout detection. So mid-print, if it goes out of filament, essentially it's gonna keep printing and you're gonna come back to a failed print, whereas other printers will actually stop it and then you can resume it later. It's not really a major problem because you can grab one for like $20 off Amazon, but I still think this is a phenomenal printer for a beginner. The type of filament to use, eSun, I recommend that. I've used that for a bunch of prints now and I am really happy with it. In terms of tools, I would say don't get any until you feel like you actually need one for one of your prints and then just order it. I think the ones that come straight in the box are good enough. And in terms of the actual process, so not doing what I did, not printing 50 retraction tests, Lord help me. Grab a cheap printer, set it up, print a simple benchy or whatever the test print is on the printer. See if there's any major issues. There honestly should not be any issues. Next is I would look at free 3D printing websites. I will also link a bunch down below. Find a model with some good ratings or a lot of downloads. Download the STL file, slice it, put it on an SD card, whack it into your printer and hit go. Honestly, the biggest hurdle with 3D printing is just like learning all the tiny little things along the way. But as long as you just only learn like one thing at a time and overcome that first before you move on to the next thing, like your journey will be so much easier. Now, I'll be doing more vlogs like this, which kind of go over the real world experience rather than just doing a tutorial, which focuses on one specific thing. And if you follow along, you'll be able to start 3D printing alongside me. But anyway, good luck and happy printing. Peace.